Well, I couldn't delay this guide forever. Today we have Machine Assassin, a DPS class that relies very heavily on debuffs for better or for worse, and mostly for worse. If you can get the playstyle to work, it can actually be a pretty fun class and do some decent damage, but it ends up being massively inconsistent because of how high enemy debuff resistance tends to be. So even when you stack all of the sources of debuff resistance down possible, it still ends up being pretty ineffective much of the time. Even the resistance down art can be resisted. It's really stupid, and honestly, I think there needs to be a fundamental overhaul to how debuffs work if you want classes like Machine Assassin to be viable. Regardless, in this video I want to discuss the Machine Assassin class, talk about its strengths and weaknesses, and showcase how to use it most effectively. As always, if you enjoy these guides, please be sure to subscribe to the channel because it really does help me out so much. Let's get into it. So, the S rank and inheritor for this class is Senna, and as such, I will be using Machine Assassin on Senna. Now, normally I would say you can pretty much run this on anyone and have plenty of success, but in this case, I would actually recommend not running this on Uni or Tyon. Tyon's Ouroboros form has a very useful skill that will lower enemy debuff resistance by 50 percentage points, and it's one of the ways to make this class not completely terrible, but even with it active, sometimes it still doesn't work the most effectively, especially on higher difficulties, because guess what? On higher difficulties, enemy debuff resistance is increased even further. It's actually lowered on easy mode, so if you want to have the most fun playing this class, you might as well play on easy mode. Regardless, I'll be using the class on Senna. Senna has pretty high attack power, so it ends up being pretty good. The skills for this class include Chaos Chain, where debuffing an enemy boosts your damage dealt by 30%, up to a maximum of 150%. Now, the nice thing about this is that you just have to debuff one enemy to get this effect, and it'll stay the entire time. So if you land 5 debuffs successfully on an enemy, you can get this full additive. Now, landing 5 debuffs can be a little difficult, but if you use Tyon's Ouroboros form early in a battle, this can be a little bit easier, and you might be able to stack up the damage boost and at least be somewhat effective in the fight. I think this is a pretty good skill, and it's probably going to be your main source of damage in many fights if you want to use Machine Assassin. Phantom Strike will add a 100% chance for attacks to be unblockable. This is a pretty nice skill in general. Basically, no enemies will ever be able to block your attacks. Pretty nice skill for any attacker to have, especially on enemies that have high block rate, simply because block rate can be very, very annoying. So I really like the ability to go by enemy block rate with no resistance whatsoever. Cursed Edge will boost damage dealt by 70% when you are attacking a debuffed enemy. So if an enemy currently has a debuff, you get a 70% damage boost on top of any other damage boost you currently have. So this is really nice if you actually can apply debuffs to enemies to get a nice 70% damage boost. Now, some enemies, it'll be really difficult to apply this, and if you can't get a debuff on an enemy, you'll end up doing a lot of mediocre damage or basically no damage at all, and other classes will end up being better. But if you can get debuffs on enemies, this can be a pretty good class. Anti-Erosion System will grant 50% resistance to all debuffs, so this makes this class pretty good against debuffs if you're getting targeted by debuffs at all. Though, to be honest, I think this should probably be a skill that increases your chance of applying debuffs. It's really weird that you have to run the Master Skill Sappy Drain to get any chance of increasing your success rate of debuffs, which is pretty much going to be required if you want to have any success with this class. Limiting what Master Skills you can kind of run and have success with, simply because you're basically forced into running this skill. I am also running Covert Attack because, essentially, if you try to set this class up for maximum damage, you end up not getting aggro reduction on much of your kit, which makes you get targeted, which means you're not going to be setting debuffs, which means you'll probably have to deal with the long cooldowns of your arts again, and you're not going to have that much success. So if you really want to take advantage of this class and stay alive as long as possible and apply as many debuffs as possible, you're probably going to want this skill. I was not having much success when I did not have this skill, as the enemy would target me very, very quickly if I did not have this or the gem set up. So I think this is probably going to be a pretty good skill to run. Now, I am not currently running critical damage up, which is definitely a skill you could consider running simply because it's always going to be a great skill, especially on a class with a 30% critical hit rate to give you another increase to all of your damage with a independent multiplier. I am running Ultimate Qigong, though, which will ignore 50% of enemies' physical defense when you're landing a hit. Most of your damage is physical with this class, and you can get a huge damage boost on all of your attacks with this, so I think this is always going to be a very useful skill to run, especially when you already have pretty good sources of additive damage with Cursed Edge and Chaos Chain. The arts for this class include Tyrant Cross. This is basically a required art to run because it'll randomly apply one debuff when an art hits. If you want to have any success with this class at all, you need to be able to apply debuffs, so this art is going to be required. Unfortunately, this art does have the pretty big weakness of having a 24-second cooldown, meaning you have to wait 24 seconds before you can apply another debuff after applying one the first time, if you even manage to apply one the first time. And given that enemies can often resist your debuffs, you can go really long periods without being able to land a debuff, which is really not good at all. Consider that the buff art Oriole is a cooldown of 3 and an Agnes-based art that you can basically spam, and you can easily pass buffs to the entire party. That makes this art really, really weak by comparison and really, really underwhelming. Fatal Bite is actually a pretty good art. It has a power multiplier of 340%, which is pretty nice when you combine it with its bonus effect of boosting damage when you attack from the side by 150%, and it even has a recharge gauge of 14 seconds, which is pretty reasonable. This is probably going to be one of your best damaging arts and a pretty high recommendation to run because of that. It also charges up your talent gauge faster, which you're definitely going to want to take advantage of with this class, so I definitely recommend running this in most situations. Terror Onslaught is probably going to be another required art. It has a 340% power multiplier as well, so it's decently powerful. And it also is a positional, meaning it'll recharge your talent gauge, and it inflicts the resistance down debuff when you attack an enemy rear. Now, if this doesn't get resisted, this is a great debuff, because it means all of your other debuffs have a much higher chance of landing. It also means that if you can use this move again while you already have a resistance down, you have an easier time of reapplying resistance down, which can make this class a little bit more successful in the long run if you can manage to do that. Definitely an art you pretty much are required to run, so you pretty much have no choice, so I've definitely run this. Havoc Slayer has a power multiplier of 440%, which is really high, but unfortunately a recharge gauge of 24%, which is always high. But it will spread debuffs to other enemies when you attack an enemy. Now, this is okay in multi-enemy fights. Most unique monsters and story bosses are not multi-enemy though, so you're not going to get the most use out of this in a lot of situations. But if you are fighting multiple enemies, especially enemies that don't have higher debuff resistance, this can actually be a pretty good art, but it is very, very situational because of that, and I would only run this if you are fighting multiple enemies. Mecha Crescent has an 11-second cooldown and a power multiplier of 180%. This will extend debuff effect duration by 20% when you hit an art. This is only useful if you can get debuffs to begin with, and despite the low cooldown, it's kind of not the best art in my opinion. There are other ways to extend debuffs that'll be far more impactful, and you don't really want to waste a valuable art slot on this art in my opinion. Viral Vector will apply 2 randomly chosen debuffs when an art hits. Now, I don't know why it says 1 in the description here. It might just be that you have to max out the class in order to get the 2 debuffs, but it is 2 on the screen when you're actually attacking and fighting enemies. Now, an enemy might resist both debuffs anyway, meaning you accomplish nothing, but you do have a chance of applying two debuffs to enemies, and with this class you want to apply as many debuffs as possible, so this is probably going to be the best talent art option to run because of that. For my master arts, I am running both Jackal Claw and Aerial Slash. This is pretty much the same art. Grants a high critical hit rate and evades enemy attacks while art is active. As a DPS class, it can be very valuable to have evasion arts, and honestly, there aren't really too many better options to consider here since you can't run any other positionals with my setup since I have both Fatal Bite and Terror Onslaught. So you might as well take advantage of pretty powerful arts that have pretty decently short cooldowns and give you guaranteed evasion and a nice critical hit rate. Overfall is the last master art I am running. This might seem a little weird, but it does apply the debuff of Ether Resistance down. It has a very low cooldown of 3, giving you a lot of chances to apply it, which can be very useful for stacking up your damage. So I think this is going to be a pretty decent skill because of that, simply because it's a really low cooldown art, allows you to spam arts more, and allows you to get more chances to use a debuff. Any other master arts that apply debuffs can be a good consideration as well, but I like personally running this. It ends up working out pretty well for me. For my gem setup, I am running Empowered Combo. This will boost my damage by 75% when I cancel into an art. I'll be canceling into arts pretty often to try to get debuffs, so this is a pretty good effect because of that. Swelling Scourge will boost the power debuff effects applied to enemies by 50%. Now, I'm choosing to run this over the duration effect because with Tyon out, it'll freeze all debuff effect durations anyway, so I don't really have to worry about debuff effect duration that much, and I really want to increase power, so stuff like resistance down actually increases the amount of resistance you reduce further, allowing you to have an easier chance to apply other debuffs. So that is the reason I would choose power over duration in this specific case. Disperse Bloodlust will reduce aggro generated by 45%. If you're already running Covert Attack and think you're not in any risk of getting aggro, you could run a Refined Incantation over this, which will extend duration of timers of debuffs applied to enemies by 50%, allowing you to have both power and duration of debuffs. You could also consider running Critical Damage Analyze Weakness to get a boost to your critical damage every time you get critical hits. That's always going to be a pretty powerful effect to have as well, and could be pretty useful to get as much damage as possible outside of your debuffs. For my accessories, I am running the Saturni Rings to boost attack as much as possible by 40% here, reaching an attack stat of 1584, which is pretty dang high, and always going to be pretty useful to have. Warped White Brooch will ignore 30% of enemy's physical defense when landing a hit. This reduces enemy physical defense by 30 percentage points, and is going to allow you to hit as hard as possible with these physical-based DPS classes like Machine Assassin. I am also running the Hermit Mask for a nice 100% added damage boost to terrestrial life, which is what 3 of the super bosses are and the ones I'll be fighting in this video. You can also run this against any specific enemy type and get a lot of damage boost because of that. You can also consider Lune Rings if you want an unconditional damage boost on all of your fusion arts. You can consider Fiber Wraps if you plan on launching an enemy and want to get a 110% damage boost on that. And there's really many damage boosting options you can consider. There's unfortunately not an accessory to increase your chance of applying debuffs yet. Maybe they'll add that in challenge mode or something, and that would be very useful to have. So this is probably going to be your best setup, just sticking to damage increases. With all that done, let's take a look at how to use Machine Assassin practically and try to apply these debuffs. So I'm going to start things off with normal mode Grand Depths. I don't really want to play hard in this video because that would make the debuff strategy even worse. And Grand Depths is known for having a high block rate, and we penetrate all block rates, so I thought it would be a pretty decent enemy to show off. First things first, I'm going to want to, near the start of the fight, activate Tion's Ouroboros just to give myself a higher chance of being able to apply debuffs. And I actually do manage to get the debuff resistance down debuff and the ether defense down debuff. So I've already applied 2 debuffs, not too bad for this class. Unfortunately, Tyrant Cross has not managed to apply a new debuff, so that's a little bit unfortunate there that we could not get that. But I'm going to try to build up my Talent Art soon and reapply resistance down. So go ahead and go for it again. And we do get to apply resistance down again while Uni and Tyon Ouroboros is still active, freezing the duration of that. And the Blaze effect actually I think comes from Tion's Ouroboros, not actually from me there. I go behind again. Unfortunately, my 2 random debuffs do not do anything, because the Uni Tyon Ouroboros had ended, and despite having Sappy Drain and resistance down, it doesn't end up being very effective, sadly. And now my resistance down is gone, which means we're probably going to have a much harder time applying debuffs until we can get Tion's Ouroboros back. So without Tion's Ouroboros, this class has a very tough time applying debuffs. As you can see, both debuffs were pretty easily resisted there, and I wasn't really able to do much about it. But since I've already applied a lot of debuffs in this fight, I at least get some decent damage on my physical attacks, and I'm not, like, completely worthless. And now I have another chance to try to go for some more debuffs here. I'm going to reactivate the Tyon and Uni Ouroboros to go for some more debuffs here. Unfortunately, those get resisted or missed or something. So even despite having that active, it can still be resisted, unfortunately. But we're back up again, so I'm going to run all the way behind, and we're going to try to do this again. I get an ether defense down, but unfortunately the resistance down debuff is actually not effective. So getting the ether defense down in spite of that's pretty nice. And now, once again, Uni and Tyon Ouroboros is no longer here, so we're not going to be nearly as effective, but at least I'm getting a damage boost because he's still currently debuffed. But I get double resisted there, and as you can see, this class is very difficult to make work. Even on normal mode, I'm still struggling to inflict debuffs using as many resources as I can to try to inflict debuffs as consistently as possible. Now, I'll go ahead and reactivate this again before using Terror Onslaught, and unfortunately, I still get resisted there on the resistance down, but I do get the ether defense down debuff again. So I at least get another 70% damage boost from that, and I have the 150% boost from at least 5 debuffs applied. So I'm not doing the worst damage in the world. Unfortunately, these arts still have really long cooldowns, so even if you are able to successfully set debuffs, you still are going to be kind of against the fact that your arts have long cooldowns anyway. Now, fortunately on easy mode, yes, I'm going to show off easy mode, debuff resistance is actually cut in half, or it's reduced at least. So you're actually going to have a much easier time of applying debuffs, and honestly, that might make easy mode actually the more fun way to play this class and actually have success, which is kind of ironic. But you'll see right here, it's much easier to apply debuffs. I already get 2 debuffs right off the bat, the resistance down and the ether defense down with basically no issues. I go for the Tyrant Cross, but that actually does get resisted, which is actually pretty rare with all of the current settings I have, with the Tyon Ouroboros active, with the resistance down, with Sappy Drain. But it does happen sometimes. At the very least, I do reapply both resistance down and ether defense down there, as you can see. So those are going to be active for a little bit longer. And now I'm going to go for my Talent Art here. So my Talent Art actually applies resistance down again, which is really funny that it picked that one randomly. I get Bind out of Tyrant Cross, which is actually really useful. Be able to bind the super boss and stop him from moving for a little bit. And then I'm able to reapply my resistance down again. And I have debuffs that are currently active, meaning I can do a lot of additional damage here. I reactivate Tyon and Uni really quickly once again to try to reapply resistance down. It ends up working, and that's going to expire soon, so I'm not going to be able to rely on that really the rest of combat. But I can take advantage of it right now to get some extra debuffs and extra damage. Cancel into Fatal Bite. I'm able to do some okay damage with this, even without critical hits over 150k. So it's not like the worst thing in the world, but it's very, very specific. Now, back on normal mode, against this super boss likes to cleanse debuffs, and Seratinia is completely immune to resistance down debuff, meaning it's even harder to apply debuffs to him no matter what, meaning that like 2 of the 5 super bosses are already going to be a huge pain to even apply debuffs to, but you can try to make it work. Unfortunately, every time you apply debuffs, this dragon likes to make himself immune for a few seconds and cleanse all debuffs when he does that, and he can just do this over and over for some reason, which is kind of annoying. But you can keep trying to reapply debuffs. Honestly, this class is really difficult to make work, as I've already said. You're really just, even if you can manage to apply debuffs consistently, you're kind of struggling with your long cooldowns on all of your arts. And it becomes very difficult to do as much DPS as other classes, and the debuffs honestly just aren't really that worth it compared to buffs, which always work and are much easier to keep uptime on and are much easier to apply much quicker. That said, this class, I think, can be made useful. It just needs a lot of buffs. It needs lower cooldowns on its arts. It needs a way to apply debuffs easier without having to rely on something like Tyan or Ouroboros, which doesn't even work sometimes. So, and especially when it's inactive, it's really going to have a hard time working. I am fortunate to get some debuffs there, but he's just going to cleanse it again with Heat Scream. So I don't really know if there's that much else to talk about with this class. It ends up being pretty difficult on many unique monsters and story enemies to even take advantage of this class fully. This class, I think, is probably a lot better on enemies that aren't unique monsters and story bosses that have lower debuff resistance. Especially maybe AoE enemies where you can spread debuffs to them with Havoc, whatever the heck that art is called. Actually forgot. But all in all, one thing I'm going to try to do here is reapply Terror Onslaught, the resistance down, and then Chain Attack. I'm not going to show the full thing, but essentially, maybe if I can get into a Chain Attack with resistance down on, I can actually apply Tyrant Cross in Chain Attacks, and that might be a strategy to consider. So I do actually get the resistance down with Tyan and Uni's Ouroboros active. Unfortunately, the Chain Attack cancels it, so when I try to go into it, it's just going to not work, and honestly, regardless of that, at the very least, fight's basically over when you Chain Attack, especially on normal mode, so I don't really feel the need to show off the rest of this, but you're going to see right there, it's still easy for enemies to just resist you no matter what you try to do, and if this was hard mode, I would be basically getting nothing no matter what. And on the very hard mode that's yet to come out, I'm sure it'll be even worse. This class is one that desperately needs buffs. It can be pretty fun and useful if you actually can manage to get debuffs and can do a decent amount of damage, but it's really hard to make work. You kind of have to waste some equipment slots on trying to make it work, and you have to run a lot of support to make it work as well, meaning it just ends up being more trouble than it's worth, and I think there's just going to be a lot of better options for DPS classes that are much less conditional. And if you really want to gain advantages for your teams, you can just use buffs instead, which always work and are infinitely easier to use. So I think this is just really, really difficult to make this class work effectively as it is right now, and I hope it gets some buffs in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned something from watching this guide, and if you really do enjoy using Machine Assassin, I hope this was able to help you out to try to get some more use out of it. As said, this is a pretty fun class, so I'd like you to get some buffs in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, comment down below, like the video, and share with all of your friends, and support me any other way you can, because I do appreciate all of it. And please look forward to the remaining 3 class guides. We are almost done, and I will have a couple other things after that, and I guess we'll be waiting for a lot of patches and new information about the game. Might even get some tomorrow at this rate. So, once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and have a wonderful and blessed day, and hopefully I will see you soon.